Welcome. My name is Christine Leonard. I'm the director of the DC office for the Vera Institute of Justice. And would like to thank all of you for coming here on a Friday afternoon at what officially I think marks the end of summer. We're grateful for your participation in today's events. And as you probably saw outside, we are really delighted with the support of the MacArthur Foundation to be launching a series of briefings regarding juvenile justice and hoping to spark a national conversation about research results and reform. And so if you saw on our flyer, we're going to cover a series of topics, and going forward we'll be doing these briefings on the House and Senate side in hopes of getting the maximum staff attendance and really encourage as many folks to attend as possible to learn about these issues and hopefully build more awareness for action going forward. So I'll just speak briefly and then turn it over to our distinguished guests who have joined us for this afternoon's events. I think that, thinking about today's activities and working in Washington, so often the conversation is dominated by all of the differences and disagreements among members of Congress, among different political parties, and, it struck me in thinking about preparation for today's event that there is definitely one thing that we all have in common, which is certainly I can say with confidence is true of everybody about this room, and that we were all teenagers. And as you look back at that period in your life, maybe there are some decisions that you made along the way that you may or may not want recorded on Facebook for later moments in time. But I think, as you look back through our country's history, you could put yourself back in the years when you were, 15 years old, and maybe some of the reckless activities you might have gotten into with your friends. And, maybe here or there on a late night Saturday night at a sleepover party, maybe you made some crank calls or, at this era, it would have been some random text messages to somebody, and what would have happened if, as a result of that, I'm seeing some heads shaking, so this might be coming back for some of you. The person on the other end got really upset and called the police. And what happened if after the police were called that they showed up at your house and your parents weren't home, you got arrested, you got taken down to the police station. Not only were you just given like a fair, stern warning, but no, actually you got locked up. And then you didn't get to call your parents got home. Of course now they're really mad at you because they're thinking, oh, what did you do? You disappeared, why aren't you here? And they're calling around and they're panicked and they can't find you. And then they call, of course, your friends because they know that if you're not here, then you're probably out with your friends. And your friends' parents tell them, actually we were making some calls and we got in trouble. They got in trouble and, he's down in the jail. So what would you think would be the consequence for something like that? I mean, what seems reasonable? I mean, maybe hopefully some of us growing up, the parents would have said, oh, no television. Oh, you can't go see that friend for 2 months. Well, what if the consequence was that you got 5 years sentenced, locked up? Well, this isn't really a hypothetical story because 47 years ago, in one of the seminal cases that really launched where the United States legal theory around juvenile justice began, there was a case involving a young man named Galt who that was exactly what happened. Those were the facts of the case. That's how he ended up incarcerated. That's what happened to his parents, how they found him. And, and from that point on, and I'm not going to speak more about the legal theory behind this because we have Marcia here today, but it set the tone for how our country began to think about these issues. And that, should there be a different standard for kids versus adults? And if you're talking about kids, like what protections should they have? And, teenagers may make mistakes. And if they make a mistake, what should the consequences be? And so here we are now in 2014. And I think many of these issues are really still alive in our society. And so we really appreciate that you've joined us for today's discussion because our goal is to talk about, what has been happening in terms of the evolving research in the field, to talk about where the states have been moving in terms of reform, to talk about what's the status of a lot of the legal cases that have flown or developed since the time of that early decision in Galt many years ago, the issues that are still ripe today. And then also we're very fortunate to have Dr. Casey here to talk about the science behind all of this in terms of adolescent development of the brain. Because again, this is something where we all come from different places, we all have different stories, but in a lot of ways, the science and the human body is something that we all share in terms of how we develop. And so again, I want to be brief, but I would encourage you, if you're thinking about some of the issues that get talked about today after you leave this afternoon's briefing and hopefully return to join us in some of the future conversations, to take a look at the report that was released last fall by the National Academy of Sciences. And more recently, last week, they've just put up on their website, and it's not ready for publication yet, so we don't have copies for you here today, but can help you find it if you need it. They've put out a report with recommendations for what the federal government can do on youth justice issues today. The report contains an itemized plan of action over the next 3 years. And again, this is a report prepared by a nonpartisan independent body of academics. And it really contains some key recommendations about reforms that can happen at the state, tribal, and local level. But why talk about this in DC? Why talk about this at the federal level? Because without major leadership from members of Congress and the federal agencies, there will not be the ability to take the steps that are necessary in order to implement policies that are grounded on adolescent development and in order to embrace this paradigm shift on where we want to go looking forward. And again, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, the approaches that can be taken with youth and that first contact with the system, they may not be solutions that cost more money. We're not going to be talking about solutions that demand new approaches in some ways. A lot of it's really about being smarter and more effective and using a lot of the techniques that have already been tried in the field and in the states about what we know that works. So I just want to go briefly through some of the guiding principles that will unite us as we move forward on these briefings, which are that kids are different than adults. Youth can be held accountable without unnecessary confinement. Youth should be treated fairly, regardless of their race or ethnicity. The need for appropriate responses to nonviolent, non-criminal behavior, the critical role of family involvement, and the need to address the disproportionate number of minority youth who come into contact with the youth justice system. And so with that, I'm just going to move quickly to briefly introduce our panelists. We've provided you with documentation with their more comprehensive bios because we really are fortunate to have a distinguished group with us today. But I'd like to turn over the panel to Laurie Garduque, who's the Director of Justice Reform at the MacArthur Foundation. Laurie has led throughout her time at the MacArthur Foundation its effort on the Models for Change initiative, which was described in some of the literature that we had for you outside. It aims to accelerate a reform movement to improve the lives of young people in trouble with the law while enhancing public safety and holding young offenders accountable for their actions. Prior to joining the foundation, as you can see in her published bio, Laurie had a lot of experience working on these issues and also spent some time walking the halls up here in Congress. In her current capacity, she's also serving on the Federal Coordinating Council on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which meets quarterly through the OJJDP offices. And we're very pleased that she's able to join us here today. Before she begins, I just want to introduce briefly the other panelists so that they can move into their remarks. Marcia Levick, who is to her right, is the Deputy Director and Chief Counsel at the Juvenile Law Center, which she co-founded in 1975. It's the oldest nonprofit public interest law firm for children in the U.S., and I won't say too much more about it right now because I hope that you'll stay to learn more about it and their work as it's featured in the film. But really, the film can't capture all that Marcia has done throughout her career, and that I really think it is not a generous statement to say that she has fingerprints on almost every major decision that has come through the U.S. Supreme Court and many federal appeals courts relating to juvenile justice during the course of her career. And so we really appreciate that she's here today to give an overview of her thoughts about where the country is today and where it may go moving forward. And then to her right is Dr. B.J. Casey, who's the director of the Sackler Institute for Development Psychobiology at the Will Medical College of Cornell University. While we're here on a Friday afternoon, part of the reason is it's very tough to find time for all of these important folks to have the same time in their schedules. But Dr. Casey is really one of the most internationally recognized individuals who has worked on adolescent brain development research. We're very excited to see her presentation today. And I think it presents a very science-based perspective on how we can think about these issues on a federal policy level. And then lastly, in the back, Robert May is here. He's the director and producer of the Kids for Cash film, who will come up and give introduction introductory remarks before the film, so I'll wait to speak more about Robert in a moment. But for now, I'll turn it over to Laurie. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and admire your fortitude for coming to hear about adolescent development and juvenile justice on a Friday afternoon. First, let me thank Vera Institute for Justice and Christine in particular for the extraordinary work it has done on these issues, as well as for planning this very ambitious set of briefings over the next several months. We're delighted with our partnership. We've been a partner with Vera for a considerable length of time, and we're excited about this inaugural event and then over the course of the next several months of building on what you learn at each stage along the way. So I'm here today because of our shared concern about reforming juvenile justice. I'm sure, as many of you are painfully aware, juvenile justice generally has a history of attracting attention when it's viewed as no longer being relevant or has outlived its usefulness. And I'd like to take my time this afternoon to tell you why that perspective is misguided and does a disservice both to the courts, the professionals involved in the courts, the judiciary, to the young people, their families, and their communities in conflict with the kids when they've gotten in trouble with the law. But most importantly, I want to talk a little bit about what the future looks like today as a result of some of the advances and changes we've seen in the landscape in terms of how to enhance public safety and how to promote continued progress in juvenile justice reform. Now, some of you know that MacArthur has been involved in juvenile justice for an extended period of time, nearly 20 years. And when we entered the field back in 1996, it was a very different landscape. It was a period of time of being tough on crime, where there was concern about super predators, and there was fears that if the juvenile justice system had outlived its usefulness, and the best response to juvenile crime and delinquency was to treat them as adults. And the kinds of reforms that we saw at that time were harsh and punitive and retributive. Not only were more kids being transferred to the adult criminal justice system, but even within the juvenile justice system, there was an abandonment of the idea of rehabilitation and treatment. So MacArthur set off on a course to reverse that trend. We knew that there were better ways to respond to young people in conflict with the law, better ways of holding them accountable, better ways of treating them fairly, and in the long run, you would protect public safety, better outcomes for kids, and save the taxpayers' dollars. So we set about working with a number of states across the country, and what we've learned in the last decade is that the tide appears to have turned, and that we are at a unique historic moment with respect to juvenile justice. Political, economic, and social forces have shifted. There's a move to roll back these more harsh, ineffective, and expensive practices towards a new approach with an emphasis on fairness, with justice being served, and more effective responses that recognizes that kids are not adults, and that holding young people accountable for their transgressions in developmentally appropriate ways both reduces harm and risk. Now, we've seen waves of reform before. In fact, the creation of the first juvenile court instituted a wave of juvenile reform. But then we had the due process protections that Christine mentioned to you. And then in turn, we had the more harsh and punitive reforms in the 80s and 90s, where we'd lost the rehabilitative ideals and focused more on punishment and retribution. But what I'm here to say to you today is that with Models for Change, I think this wave of juvenile justice reform we see sweeping across the country is quite different. Under Models for Change, the foundation has supported a network of government and court officials, legal advocates, educators, community leaders, and families from across the country committed to protecting kids while making communities safer and improving the effectiveness, performance, and outcomes of the juvenile justice system. Together, these different groups have supported numerous changes in laws and policies and practices, and in turn, we've worked now in over 35 states. Now, when we started working in Models for Change, we focused initially on 4 core states and helping them make statewide juvenile justice reform changes. Those states were Pennsylvania, Illinois, Louisiana, and Washington. Very diverse states. with the idea being that regardless of the starting point, regardless of the economic, social, and political forces, regardless of the history and track record, that you could take a state from wherever it was starting and make advancements in terms of its juvenile justice system. In addition to those 4 core states, we worked in an additional 12 states where they focused on specific juvenile justice reform issues, reducing racial and ethnic disparities, improving the behavioral health care of kids in conflict with the law, and improving the quality of juvenile indigent defense. We had a shared set of values and principles about respecting the developmental differences between kids and adults, of the importance of protecting public safety, the need for greater racial and ethnic fairness, but we did not tell the states what to do. We had certain design principles, but we didn't have a blueprint. We didn't have a model program. We didn't come in to tell them these are the particular policies and practices you should adopt. We said develop local leadership, build collaborative efforts working across the different constituencies and stakeholders in the courts, provide practical information, give people tools and resources, respond and adapt to changing circumstances. And so each state, each local jurisdiction participating in Models for Change set off on its own course of juvenile justice systems reform, which we then embraced and endorsed and supported their efforts. So we've seen notable successes in juvenile justice reform now across a diverse, if you're working in 35 states, you've covered pretty much most of the country with very different, with extraordinary regional differences. So we have kids with mental health needs or who are involved with the child welfare system being diverted from the juvenile justice system in its entirety. Fewer kids are being locked up. More kids are receiving evidence-based community services. More of them have attorneys providing zealous advocacy earlier in the process, and kids of color suffer less harm. We're seeing this across the country in vastly different states, in rural, suburban, and large metropolitan areas, and even in tribal nations. We've seen jurisdictions achieve a better balance in holding young people accountable, treating them fairly, and preventing reoffending. So what we've seen, in fact, over the last decade is a 40% reduction in youth confinement while juvenile crime has declined. We've seen changes in terms of raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction in Illinois, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. We've seen large youth prisons close in New York, Texas, Nevada, Nebraska, and Ohio. We've seen the rolling back of automatic transfer laws in Colorado, increased funding for what works in states across the country, improvements in juvenile indigent defense, better aftercare, and greater coordination between juvenile justice and child welfare. Now, much of this work is grounded in the seminal research that the Foundation supported 15 years ago that BJ will talk about in terms of showing how adolescents are fundamentally different from adults. We have known for decades that kids are different from adults, but we didn't understand what the legal implications of those differences are. And what MacArthur set out to do was to look at the differences between juveniles and adults to understand how the law should be treat them differently accordingly. And so what the research showed was that juveniles take risks. They fail to often foresee the consequences of their action. They're vulnerable to peer pressure, but they have tremendous capacity to change. So when you look at juvenile justice jurisprudence, that means that they're less blameworthy than adults, and that in holding them accountable, that their reduced culpability, there are these mitigating factors that need to be taken into account. And we now have the 4 Supreme Court decisions that Marcia will tell you more about, as well as the National Academy of Sciences report, talking about then what that implications are for juvenile justice reform. So for those of us who've been following juvenile justice closely for decades, in many respects, the reforms that we're seeing simply represent a turn back to the fundamental principles of a separate justice system for kids from adults. For those of you who are concerned about effectiveness and efficiency, the idea of relying on what works and cost-benefit analyses suggests a better return on investment. And for others of us, for many of the people in this room today, it's what should happen when kids make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are tragic. And how to balance accountability with the fact that it is a young person that has committed this offense poses a serious challenge to all of us. But we need to understand how to manage the risks they pose to themselves and to others. We need to repair the harm, and we need to help them come back to society prepared to be productive adults. So we have made real progress, I think. But the truth of the matter is about 1.6 million kids get arrested every day. And disproportionately, the kids who get involved in the justice system are minority kids from disadvantaged communities. And many of those kids, still 60,000 kids on any given night, are incarcerated. So what are we here today to talk to you about, given that much of this work has occurred at the state and local level? I want to reiterate what Christine said. This is not necessarily about more resources. This is about using existing resources more effectively. Much of the innovation and the creativity and the leadership has come at the state and local level. But we still have a problem with justice by geography in the United States. We still need national leadership on these issues. And so if we're going to spread and if we're going to take to scale these reforms, there is a need for national leadership. And there is a need to use the federal resources more effectively and efficiently. That there are also broad constitutional issues that suggest these are national issues, not just state and local issues. So I hope that we're giving you a starting point to think about what national leadership and what the role of the federal government can be in this domain. MacArthur has been in this field for 20 years, but the truth of the matter is foundations have initiatives. We have time-limited goals and strategies. MacArthur's invested about $160 million over the last 15 years in juvenile justice, but we're going to be gone out of the field in a year and a half. And so we're very concerned about how to secure and sustain the momentum and the progress that is made in juvenile justice. We know how to identify kids. We know how to get the right kids the right services at the right time. We know how to get a better return on the taxpayer's dollar. We know how to improve public safety. Those lessons learned are very grounded in what has happened in states and in local jurisdictions across the country. And we would like to see more national leadership on these issues. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for having me here.
If you don't mind, I'm going to sit here so I can show you a few movies. I think many times when we're talking about the brain, a picture or a movie is worth 1,000 words. Thank you, Laurie, and those great words, and to the MacArthur Foundation, and also Christine. Thank you very much, and many thanks to the Vera Institute. And also for all of you being here on a summer, end of the summer, nice but hot day. I think it's increasingly become aware to all of us that adolescent brain research is being used and called upon when judges and legal legislatures and as well as policymakers are suggesting that we treat adolescents in a different way than we do adults, and we'll come back to this point. But I also just wanted to really begin with this crime curve, this inflection during the teenage years, when we see individuals beginning to come into the system and beginning to engage in these behaviors, some caught and some having to deal with the consequences. But when you see inflections in behaviors like this, the question we want to know is, why is this behavior happening? And how can we deal with it? And how can we hold individuals who engage in this behavior accountable? And how do we prevent them from coming back into the system again? So really, our question has been, what's the underlying biology? What's going on in the brain that is creating this inflection that we're seeing during the adolescent period of time? So let me begin by just showing you a cartoon of what we've learned from post-mortem studies and even animal studies before I show you the newer technology where we can literally look under the hood of the teenage brain while they're in action in an almost voyeuristic way. But this simple cartoon, I hope what you can see from it is that there are many different changes that are occurring during the adolescent period when the brain is being marinated in gonadal hormones, when puberty emerges. It's also a time when different regions are changing with regard to the connections that are being made and maintained. And it's also a time when we're seeing neurochemical changes, as well as myelin or white matter, which helps areas in the brain that are talking to one another talk to one another more efficiently. But with the advent of human brain imaging, again, we can now look inside the brain and see how they're behaving and look at structures, changes in structures that might help to explain the changes in behavior across this time period. Let me just begin with this movie. This is looking at cortical thickness, the outside surface of the brain. And as you see any area that's turning blue, that area is already reaching adult levels of development. So if I take you through that movie again, what you'll notice is that some areas, even in the 5-year-old period, are blue. Those areas that continue and don't turn blue until around 21 years of age are ones that are taking much longer to develop. It's easier to see this movie just showing you a static picture at this point. Just focus on the bottom half. This is as if you're looking down on top of someone's brain. It's areas that allow us to move in the motor cortex and to see that logically develop before those areas that use those abilities to guide our future planning and actions before they develop. And one of the areas that's developing the slowest, this is in the front of the brain. You can also see it in this top picture here. It's one of the slowest. It's the prefrontal cortex, and it's involved in rational and reasoning, but rational thought and reasoning. And also, it helps keep track of what's happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future. Now, it's not just these prefrontal cortex, which many times I think the teenager's been described as having no brakes, all accelerator, no prefrontal cortex whatsoever. It's there. It's just getting wired across development with experiences, but there are also very important changes that are happening in deep structures of the brain that we tend to think of more when we think about adolescent behavior. So fight, flight, rage, desire, those systems are changing in very deep regions. So this is a glass cartoon of the brain, and where you see these fuchsia changes in the front, yes, those are significant changes that are going on in structure. These slightly subtle changes are still going on and maturing and are much more active during this adolescent period. Again, at the same time when we're seeing the initiation of puberty and its maintenance. And so that's led many of us to realize we can no longer just talk about how the prefrontal cortex is changing, but we need to understand the communication and how these deep emotional centers in the brain are changing at a time when this area in the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And this is the very area that helps to regulate those emotional centers. And with development, they're able to talk to each other better, particularly with the right experiences. So now let's just link those changes in the brain to specific examples for you in behavior. And really, a hallmark of development with children, adolescents, and also into adulthood, we vary in our ability to really regulate our behavior. That is, increasingly with age, we get better and better at being able to stop ourselves from doing inappropriate actions and actually doing the appropriate thing. But it takes a while for us to build that ability ourselves. For so long, our parents have helped us to do that, and they've been our prefrontal cortex to help us regulate our behavior. If you just were to perform a laboratory task where it looked at how well you could stop yourself, so most of the time, let's say you're just pressing a button, and then there's this rare signal that if it beeps, you have to stop pressing that button. What you see is across childhood, adolescents and adults, you get better and better. So this is proportion of false alarms. What a false alarm really means is just you went and you should not have. You did something and you should have stopped yourself. And if we perform a task like this at the same time that we're taking pictures in a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, what we see is there's one area of the brain that correlates and maps onto this particular pattern. And that's an area in the prefrontal cortex. So here you're looking down inside the brain. It's as if I pulled up a layer of it, and you can see the workings of the brain. And what I want you to note is that this activity parallels what we just saw in behavior. So this is an example. The prefrontal cortex is still continuing to develop. And it's the activity when you actually can stop yourself that's tightly coupled with your overall performance. So this is just showing that it's related to function. But this is a laboratory task. It's a laboratory task where you're simply stopping yourself to cues. But what we know with regards to many of the behaviors that teens often find themselves getting into trouble is it's associated with some sort of incentive or reward, something that's pulling them out there. So I also just want to highlight for you how the representations of these incentives and rewards are changing in the brain across this period of time in adolescence. And also, just to remind you that each of us responds very differently, even without our conscious awareness of cues that have been in the past associated with reward. If you're smiling in the audience, might orient to you more. If someone's engaging you in conversation, even you find yourself directing yourself to them more than other people who would just maybe look at you with no expression. And so let me just show that in a reaction time. So over the course of an experiment, this is just time on the bottom line, this is how quick individuals get when they've detected a cue, and there were 3 distinct cues, just 3 different pictures, and one of them was associated with winning a lot of money, a little bit of money, and hardly any money at all. And just notice, over the course of a few minutes, individuals get faster and faster and faster, that cues that are associated with a lot of money, and they get significantly slower to those pictures they're detecting that give them no money. And at the end of the experiment, they can't tell you which picture went with which amount of money. And so the behavior is already changing without being consciously aware of it. It's also the case that the brain is changing. And there's an area that's very important in picking up on rewards in the environment. And now is what I want to show you now is how the teenage brain processes these rewards differently. This is showing you that deep emotional structure in the brain. We refer to it as the accumbens. But this is how much activity you see for the same reward in a teenager as opposed to a child or adult. Now is when you're seeing these inflections that are adolescent specific and look a bit more like the criminal inflection I was showing you with regard to behaviors that were occurring or merge around adolescence and then they come down in young adulthood. Now why this is so powerful is it turns out that the amount of activity in this region is correlated with everyday real world risk-taking behavior. And that's shown here for you. So your activity to receiving reward is correlated with this. And what I want you to note is adolescents are activating this region more. And we see whenever an individual is about to make a risky decision in other experiments, regardless of age, they activate this region. So the fact that teenagers are activating it more during this time is giving us some clues to what's pulling their behavior, perhaps. But what else do we think about teenagers? They're also incredibly influenced by peers. And criminal acts are typically distinct from adult acts because so many more occur with accomplices and individuals their same age than with adults. So let's just look at the simple impact of having a positive social cue. I sort of used this as an example before about how positive cues can drive our behaviors in a certain way. If you now do a laboratory task where instead of asking them to stop whenever they see that rare light that signals you not to press a button, and instead you just use a social cue like a smiling face, look at how the behavior differs in teenagers relative to children and adults. It's almost as if they can't help themselves. When they're getting a positive social cue, They tend to press that button even when they're not supposed to, and you're not seeing this pattern in younger children or in older adults. And then again, if we turn and we look in the brain to see what is changing in the brain that's specific to this pattern when the teenagers are pulled more, we see to these positive social cues, they're activating that same deep emotional reward center in the brain, the accumbens. So basically, just a punchline just from that little set of studies is that adolescents' brains are recruiting much more activity in this reward center, even it's the same amount of monetary reward, and the same type of cues or social cues, these same type of social cues are actually activating them more. They're more reactive. Now, that was positive social cues. But many times when individuals start to get into trouble, they might start in all good fun, but then when the law comes down or when something else changes and it goes amok and they aren't anticipating that, then we're talking about negative information. And how does negative cues, potential cues of threat, how does that impact their decision making, their choices, and impulse control? We recently completed a study that just came out this year, and we were surprised by this. But it is the case that teenagers, when they see a face like this, they also tend to be, it pulls them. So it's as if they're drawn to danger as opposed to avoiding it, as we would do. And you can see that children aren't approaching threat at all here, and neither are adults. But our teenagers, and let me just qualify this, particularly male teenagers, are much more impulsive, even when it's these negative social cues, as well as positive. And I don't think that you're going to be surprised when I say, if we just look at how they process negative threat cues, you see these deep structures in the brain. Now, this is an area that tries to understand the emotional significance of cues in the environment so it knows whether or not it should be associated with fight or flight. And this area is much more active in teenagers than it is children or adults to the exact same information that's presented to them. And so I really just underscore that again with this slide and saying that these emotional centers, when they're activated, and the adolescent has to make a decision as to whether or not to go or stop, they tend to go. They see the siren, rather than pulling over, they accelerate, then something else goes wrong that they never anticipated or calculated in oftentimes. But what about the other part that I mentioned in terms of crimes being performed with accomplices or peers when they're juveniles? And here's where I want to illustrate a point about the significant influence of peers on decision making that Larry Steinberg has done, and this has been part of work that's been supported by the MacArthur Foundation too. And anybody in this room that drives has played this game before. All this game is on a video screen, and that is you play the game of, do you go through the yellow light at the intersection or do you wait? And depending on how close you are to the intersection, when the light turns yellow, will, for us, determine whether or not we go through there. But what Larry added to this task that's very interesting manipulation is he had the teenagers and the adults play the game either by themselves or with a peer sitting next to them. And so let me just show you the performance here. There's a lot of information in this slide, but I want you to notice that this is just risky decisions about going through the intersection, and these are crashes, which are shown here. It's supposed to be a broken windshield. I don't know if you can tell that from your seats there. The blue bars are when the individual's by themselves, and this is age at the bottom. So what you should be able to see from this slide is that teenagers are no different from young adults or older middle-aged adults when they're by themselves in performing this task and the number of crashes. But the minute you put someone next to them, then you're seeing them activated and making much riskier choices. And if you look at the brain when they're making these risky decisions and deciding to go when in fact they should have stopped, you see the same deep area in the brain that accumbens reward center. So what these results say is simply the presence of a peer can get a teenager to do something that adults aren't going to do in terms of their risky decisions. And I just wanted to, before I summarize, I also wanted to say, look, adolescence isn't special to humans. It's not something that we've created. Even rodents engage in novelty seeking, fighting with their parents, and spending more time with their peers during the adolescent time. And another study that Larry Steinberg has recently collaborated on wanted to see how do peers influence mice and their drinking behavior. And so he simply just put either a mouse by himself in his cage with alcohol available to him, or put that mouse with a cage mate. And it's very striking. I don't think I anticipated this. The juvenile mice actually drink more when they're in their social setting with their cage mates than the adults do, and they do that more in the social situation than when they're just by themselves. So let's just highlight what I've just given you a flavor of the research today that I think is really relevant to us thinking about adolescent behavior, and to just state that as a group, teens have difficulty in overriding inappropriate actions. And these actions, particularly when they're having to regulate themselves in the presence of peers or emotionally charged situations. And basically, this decrease in or diminished capacity to regulate their behavior coincides when there is this imbalance or tension between this slowly developing prefrontal cortex and these almost electrified emotional centers in the brain that are picking up on threat or picking up on reward. So we're seeing this sort of imbalance that when you activate both in an emotionally charged situation, it's almost like it's trying to hijack that prefrontal rational regulation system. And then the third point is, just as we showed that the crime curve, so too is adolescence transient. So it's a transient period of typical development. And what you see is that the brain continues to be wired during this period of time through experiences and over the course of maturational processes. So with regard, and I know Marcia's going to talk about this more, but if we think about the implications that this has for policies, we can come back to the Supreme Court decisions. This last with Miller and Jackson, I just wanted to mention the data I've given you today. It was almost like a triple or quadruple whammy in these cases. They were both 14-year-olds. They were both males. There were emotional circumstances in which the murders occurred. And so if we link that up with a triple whammy, we're talking about right in the peak period of adolescence. And as I showed you before, males, regardless of whether or not it's positive information or negative, seem to be more activated, but particularly activated in these emotionally charged situations. And then, too, just to make this point about how do we make teens accountable and not see them again in the system, what we have to understand is something I had to understand as a parent. I used to think for my 19-year-old, who'll be 20 soon, but still in the teenage years, I used to think if I just locked him up until he was 21 and kept him away from everything, that he would be fine and come out magically on the other end of adolescence. That is not how the brain gets wired to reach the mature level. The way that we're fine-tuning the brain is through experiences. And one of the reasons teenagers are being activated is so that they can learn to regulate their own behaviors, because they're not going to have an adult with them, and when they're adults themselves and having to negotiate new situations. And so for the brain to get wired appropriately, the adolescent needs opportunities to engage in. They can test the rules, but they need to have the opportunity to engage in pro-social behaviors. And we also know from a long literature of neuroscience that you can also learn from watching others. And so the importance of positive social role models in their lives too is going to be very important. So while we've thought about adolescence many times as a joyride, it's really a period of time of thrills and real fears. And that reactiveness is actually helping them learn to regulate their own behaviors so that the brain can function at an adult level as it's wired. So I just want to end by saying that the MacArthur Research Network on Law and Neuroscience is actually has been funding a project that will come to an end this year that's more precisely trying to understand exactly how decisions are made by adolescents versus adults in very emotionally charged, sustained situations that aren't as simple as some of the ones that I illustrated for you today. So I'll stop there and let Marcia, do you want to go to the podium?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I will also echo the thank yous to Vera, to MacArthur, and particularly to Christine and to Sarah for getting us all in the room today. I'm going to keep my comments brief, actually, because I think we want to get to the show, the main event. But what I thought I would just do is actually put some of the information that you just heard in both an historical context and a present-day context. The historical context is to appreciate that we've had a juvenile justice system in the United States for about 115 years. We have the first juvenile court was created in Cook County in Illinois in 1899. And I don't presume that all of you necessarily know that. And if you have had the opportunity to be spared involvement with the justice system in any way, you probably don't know that much about how the justice system treats juvenile offending or even adult offending, other than what you see on television and Law and Order and every other law show that is on that is available to you. So I think it's important to appreciate that the system in some respects is young in terms of the United States history, but it also is old in the sense that we are looking at over a century of practice. And I think that what that history can be boiled down to over time, Laurie talked about waves of reform that we've experienced with the juvenile justice system, is really one of what I would say marking boundaries, changing boundaries, and blurring boundaries. And what I mean by that is that in 1899, there was a decision made by the founders of the original juvenile court to treat kids differently. It wasn't necessarily grounded in research. We didn't know empirically the ways in which kids are different from adults in 1899 in the ways that we do today because of the research that Dr. Casey has done, that the MacArthur Foundation has funded for the last 20 years. But we do know that today. That original system was one that was protective. It was focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. It operated in secret to a large degree, which is something to keep in mind when you watch the film this afternoon. And it was intended to be benevolent. The idea was to set process aside and deal with juvenile offending in a way that was more about treatment than it was about revenge or retribution. That all changed really in the 90s. So we had a very, very long history, many decades, of, for the most part, treating kids differently. The fact that when Gerald Galt, at the age of 15, was sent away for 5 years to a training school in Arizona for making phony phone calls, that was, in its own bizarre way, reflective of what the juvenile justice system thought it was about, but it prompted a due process revolution that forced us to impose process, create an adversarial system that really was designed to get at the truth of conviction and guilt or not. But that due process revolution was very quickly followed a couple of decades later by this very high, intense focus on criminality, retribution, and punishment. And as there was a spike in crime, I can look around the room and say that a lot of you actually were too young to know about this spike in crime. But there was a spike in crime in the 90s, and it was a spike that was across the country, and it involved juveniles and adults. It wasn't limited to juveniles. And it was a spike in violent crime, which creates fear, and fear drives policy. And those policies that spread across the country, frankly, like wildfire, every single state was affected. Those policies mostly pushed kids into the adult system, so that we had this original marking of boundaries 115 years ago between juveniles and adults and creating a separate system. In the 1990s, we had a blurring of boundaries and almost a shifting of boundaries where we saw state legislatures, which make most of the juvenile justice policy in the country, making it easier to try kids as adults and really not so much abandoning the rehabilitative model that the juvenile justice system seemed to stand for, but in a sense setting it aside for a vast majority of the population of kids who offend and pushing them into the adult justice system and subjecting them to adult forms of punishment. That process and that adultification of juvenile behavior, this notion that kids are defined by the crimes they commit, and if kids commit serious crimes, they must be adults, which I hope sounds odd to you as I say it, and hopefully there's some thinking of how does that work? That really continued for about 15 years until it was upended by the U.S. Supreme Court. So I'm going to run briefly through the 4 Supreme Court cases and then just set the stage for where I think we might be going in the future, picking up on some of Laurie's comments. As a consequence of this adultification of juvenile offending and pushing kids into the adult system, it meant that kids simply would get the same punishments as adults. And those punishments were severe. They included the death penalty. They included life without parole sentences. And in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court had the opportunity to revisit, actually, the constitutionality of the juvenile death penalty under the Eighth Amendment. It had actually decided in 1989 that it was perfectly acceptable under our Constitution to leave juveniles who were 16 and 17 who committed homicide crimes eligible for the death penalty and allowed for them to be executed. In the summer before, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Roper versus Simmons in 2005. There were a couple of children in the United States who were adults at the time, but had been children when they were convicted, who were executed in this country. So in 2005, the Supreme Court, in revisiting that earlier 1989 decision, ruled the juvenile death penalty unconstitutional. 5 years later, the Supreme Court had the opportunity to address whether or not juveniles could be given life without parole sentences in non-homicide crimes. In both Roper and then in Graham in 2010, and subsequently in Miller 2 years ago, the Supreme Court decisions were completely grounded in the research that Dr. Casey just shared with you and other pieces of that research that came out of the MacArthur's Research Network on Adolescent Development. And importantly, what you saw today, which was all about the brain research and brain imaging and how that illustrates in very physical and organic ways what's going on biologically and neurologically. The truth is that the developmental scientists, like Dr. Steinberg, had already established the kinds of behaviors that Dr. Casey talked about as also being simply connected to behavioral research and discernible through behavioral research. So the kinds of characteristics that I think Christine mentioned and that Dr. Casey reiterated, this notion of susceptibility to peer pressure, immaturity of judgment and impetuosity, this capacity for change and rehabilitation, these are all characteristics of youth and distinctive characteristics of youth and adolescence that you won't see in adults that specifically drove the Supreme Court's decisions in these sentencing cases. So we had the death penalty, we had life without parole in the Graham decision. In 2012, the Supreme Court was again asked to look at the issue of a mandatory life without parole sentence in cases where juveniles had been convicted of homicide crimes. The court had a couple of opportunities to think about how it might resolve that issue, but it ended up addressing the very narrow question of whether or not juveniles convicted of homicide crimes could receive a mandatory life without parole sentence. And relying on the research that you've just heard in very summary form, what the Supreme Court said in a decision written by Justice Kagan was to essentially say, kids are different. That goes without saying now. It's not even really something that we debate with anybody anymore. Because they're different, it also means that we need to treat them as individuals. And if we think about those characteristics, those attributes of adolescence that you've heard us all identify today, we can't recognize those attributes, those individual characteristics, unless we look at each child individually. And so the court said we can't have mandatory sentencing for kids. Certainly not in the question that was before it. In Miller, we can't have a mandatory life without parole sentence for kids where it prohibits us and precludes judges or sentencers from examining each individual's history family history, social history, involvement in the crime, educational history, drug history, mental health issues, all the kinds of things that create and lead to and contribute and exacerbate those adolescent traits of impetuosity and immaturity of judgment. So we have had a series of cases. I mentioned the 3 sentencing cases. The 4th case, which is important to mention just because it's another one that simply builds on this research, was a case called JDB versus North Carolina. JDB was an interrogation case. So everybody knows the Miranda warnings because there's no way you can't know them in America if you watch TV. But the reality is that up until 3 years ago, juveniles were treated exactly the same way in determining whether or not they needed to be Mirandized and whether you could suppress those statements as you and I would be treated were we to be interrogated by police. There was no recognition that how a child viewed their engagement with law enforcement, their opportunity to terminate an interrogation, the possibility that they could walk out of a room when a policeman is interrogating them, no recognition that that perception might be different until JDB, until 2 years ago, or 3 years ago in 2011, when the Supreme Court said kids are different, we can't have the same test, we need to think about whether or not a kid would feel free to terminate a police interrogation through the lens of that juvenile. So those are the Supreme Court cases. What does it all mean for the purposes of going forward, for the sessions that Vera, I know, has planned going forward for all of you? I think the takeaway message that you should have is that the landscape has changed. That, again, while we had a blurring of borders and almost a changing of borders, we're back to defining borders. And those borders are defined by this recognition that kids are different, and most importantly, they're different for the purposes of their culpability and their blameworthiness. Those attributes that we've been listing are really about how we measure juveniles' culpability for their offending. And if we say it's at a lower end of the scale, which is what the research tells us, then the Supreme Court has responded in a series of very big cases in a very short period of time, really revolutionizing how we think about kids' rights under the Constitution, particularly the Eighth Amendment, but also in terms of due process considerations, that what the court is telling us is that juvenile status, the status of being a child, matters in how we define our interaction and our interventions with them when they engage in criminal behavior. And so when I think it's obvious to think about what is the federal role here, there's no denying the juvenile justice system is largely I've actually heard Bob Listenby say 56 systems in the country, because I guess there are territories as well as a district and 50 states. There may be 56 juvenile justice systems in the country, but there's one Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, and there are other pieces of federal legislation that influence policy and drive policy at the state level. There are also juveniles in the federal criminal system and in federal facilities, and how the federal government treats those individuals and how it responds to their offending behavior has substantial and significant ripple effect across the states. Again, it's an incredibly important leadership role that you play, and I think that as you watch the film this afternoon, you're going to see a system, a piece of and a part of the juvenile justice system that broke in a corner of Pennsylvania. But I think that at the end of the day, it's also a message about thinking about how we treat kids who offend, using science and research that is now in our hands and at our fingertips, and making better decisions.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia. So that was pretty heavy. And I just, as we take a moment, we appreciate again that all of you are here today on a Friday afternoon. Our staff's going to pass out some snacks to those of you that are here with us. As you settle in, we're not in quite movie theater style seating, but we're going to dim the lights and start the film. I think we're going to take a few questions maybe as we do that transition. But I just wanted to also take a moment for those of you that are here working on the Hill right now. 10 years ago, I came back to work on the House side, and I had finished law school and thought I knew something about the juvenile justice system until I had the opportunity to go out with some folks who worked with youth here in the district to see the facility that DC had at that time. You may have heard of it. It's called Oak Hill. It is no longer used as a place where kids are held in confinement. But at the time, there were still some youth from DC who were placed there. It's right out across the border in Maryland. And it was a pretty stunning experience. You know, you walk up and down the halls of that facility at the time that it was running, and, you know, you can't say anything more than that if you felt claustrophobic. There were rodents in the facility. There were horrible conditions for youth, and that, there was barely any sunlight. There was no educational programming. It's not a place you would want to spend a day, much less any other extended period of time. And I just remember coming back from the ride from that trip, and Sarah, you can go ahead and get the setup, and thinking to myself, like, how is it possible that we're literally only 15 minutes away from the nation's capital, and we've got kids living in these kinds of conditions? And then at the end of the trip, we stopped at the DC jail, which if you haven't been in, is worth going there as a visitor when you have a chance. But, where they keep the kids there at the DC jail is down in the basement, and part of the reason that they do that is to keep them safe from some of the older defendants or the offenders who may be there for a longer period of stay. And again, 17 blocks from here, that's the best our country has in terms of the conditions for some of these kids and in terms of what the impact of being inside of those facilities may have on them. And again, I think that one of the things that, you've heard today is that kids make mistakes, and there's certainly no effort here to suggest that there shouldn't be accountability. But should we have a system that's fair? And what should happen in terms of how kids are treated? And as you came in today, we had an article from the Washington Post that, now in 2014, the district is still using shackling when kids are brought into court, some as young as 8 years old. Now, again, I think that the first priority has to be our public safety, and we need to make sure that the marshals and the other people working in the court have a safe proceeding. But at the same time, when you take a step back and you think about what the impact of an experience must have like that on a young person and what the feeling might be, I thank you for being here today. I want to turn it over to Robert May to introduce the film. But I also just want to say briefly and on a very personal level, we were starting to think about how we could talk about these issues on Capitol Hill. It's as Marcia said, there hasn't been a lot of congressional attention to the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act in some time. There have been a number of important hearings, but as staff, maybe you haven't had to focus on these issues for a while. Well, I went to see the film a few months ago, and it had such a tremendous impact on me that I thought that it was really important that we try and show it again. I hope that you're able to stay and to see it, but also we'll be very eager to hear your reactions to the film after we're done. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert and let Sarah turn it.
All right, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Christine and the Vera Institute for inviting us here. Also, I never get this opportunity very often, but to thank Laurie, Garduque, and the MacArthur Foundation who helped make the film possible. So I'm going to introduce the film very differently today because it's a Friday afternoon, it's summer, and it's a documentary, as they say, and so what's that all about? So I'm going to introduce it very differently, but kind of boldly, and it's going to sound a little bragging, but I tell you for a reason. So this film is a film about a small town scandal that rocks a nation. That's why I did the film. I didn't care or even know about any issue whatsoever, and we stumbled upon the issue of juvenile justice and how we're destroying kids in this country, even today, even regardless of all of the progress that's been made. And I'm the father of 2 teenagers, so I get to see a lot of it firsthand. And what Dr. Casey also pointed out is very, very evident in my family as well when I see my kids grow up. But here's the bold thing. Here's the bragging I'm going to do, so it may keep your attention just to stay long enough to get hooked into the film. In that the film has been critically acclaimed. It was a New York Times critics pick, a Voice critics pick, New York Times, or in New York, LA Times, Washington Post. And I have to say that it was also called Riveting by the Hollywood Reporter, rivals most fiction films by the Hollywood Reporter, and by Variety, and it was also reviewed in Entertainment Weekly as entertainment. So don't think of it as, oh gosh, it's a Friday afternoon, I'm going to sit through some, institutional film. This is a film we want every parent to see. You be the judge after you see the film. And hopefully you enjoy it for the entertaining side of it and certainly take away something that I think and I hope will be powerful for you in the work that you do. Thanks.